this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the World War II podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, over 125,000 Japanese Americans living in the continental United States were incarcerated in prison camps. The majority of these people were born in America and US citizens. This was authorised by an executive order from President Roosevelt. The Japanese Americans complied and spent years in the camps. Even though incarcerated, they remained loyal Americans. And when the call came for volunteers for the army, first the 100th Infantry Battalion was formed and then the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, a unit in which thousands of Japanese Americans volunteered to serve. Between them, these two units were awarded over 4,000 Purple Hearts and 21 men received the Medal of Honor. In post-war America, the narrative of the treatment of Japanese Americans shifted, and in 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed into law the Civil Liberties Act, which officially apologised for the incarceration on behalf of the US government. Joining me today is Mitchell Mackay. Mitchell is the President and CEO of the Go for Broke National Education Centre, a non-profit organisation dedicated to preserving the legacy and lessons of the Nisei World War II veterans. And he is also the author of Achieving the Impossible Dream, How Japanese Americans Obtained Redress. Mitchell, we should perhaps start by looking at the history of Japanese migration to the US. When did the Japanese migrants start to arrive? Were they looking for a new life in America?
The earliest immigrants from Japan actually landed in Hawaii about 150 years ago in the 1870s and so forth. And they were adventurers at that particular time. But the first real wave, if you will, of immigrants starts in the late 1800s. And they're primarily men who are leaving Japan because they're looking for a better life. You know, in Japan, they were farmers and fishermen, and that's what was the need in Hawaii at that time. And so they were hiring folks. So the first wave starts to come into Hawaii, and these are sojourners who are thinking they're going to come to this new land where the roads are paved in gold. They're going to make their killing, and then they're going to go back to Japan as rich men. Well, we know, obviously that wasn't the case in any way, shape, or form. What they found when they came to Hawaii, and then later as they start to move to the continental United States, was they found hard labor and low wages, and also a society that did not necessarily embrace them culturally or ethnically or racially. Things start to continue to move forward. And around the turn of the century, around the 1900s, is when women started to come. And primarily they would come as picture brides. And this was, I think, the original internet dating, if you will, right? Where families of young women would send photos, and the men in Hawaii or on the continent would send photos of themselves, and the match would be made and the arrangements would be made. And these young women would cross the ocean with really just a photo of the man that they're going to meet and marry. And just as in internet dating today, you can't trust what you're given. And there are numerous stories of these women disembarking the ship, looking for this handsome 25-year-old man, only to find this old 50-year-old guy that had sent somebody else's photo. And then people would often ask, well, why didn't they just leave? Why didn't they run away and so forth? I mean, where would they go? They didn't speak English. There was only a small Japanese community, so they couldn't find refuge anywhere else. So for the most part, I mean, there are always isolated stories, but for the most part, the women just went along with it and would get married, and at least they would form a partnership that would resemble the family. So it wasn't a family built on love and trust necessarily in the way that we romantically think about it, but it was a partnership. And from that partnership came what we call the Nisei, the second generation Japanese Americans, the firstborn American generation. And with that comes citizenship. So a lot of the Nisei were born in the early 1900s, 1910s, 1920s. My parents were born in the 20s in the territory of Hawaii. So they were born with citizenship rights. And that began the migration. And I think it's important to keep in mind that, they came into a nation that really didn't welcome them as fellow human beings. They welcomed them as laborers. They welcomed them for the resources that they could provide. But there were anti-alien land laws. They weren't allowed to buy land. Anti-miscegenation laws. They weren't allowed to marry who they wanted. Certainly renting and forming communities was limited by local municipality laws and so forth. And they were viewed as a subhuman species, not as fellow human beings. And in 1924, the Gentleman's Agreement occurred where essentially Japan and America agreed to shut the door on future immigration of new immigrants. And so that's why for Japanese Americans, at least at that period, the generations are pretty clearly identified as those who were the immigrants, who we call the Issei, and those who were the American-born, who we call the Nisei.
How successful of a community was? I mean, how big is the community? How big is the Japanese American community?
Well, again, and there are really two locations where Japanese Americans pretty much congregated. One was in the territory of Hawaii, and with that population was larger. I don't know the exact number, but the other would be on the west coast of the continent, primarily California, but to some extent in Oregon and in Washington. By the time the forced exclusion came about in 1942 on the continent, there were about 120,000, a little bit less than that, people who were forcibly removed from the West Coast to be sent to these camps. So relatively speaking, this is not a large community, in terms of when you compare it to other communities and just the number of people that were in the United States at this point. East of the West Coast, once you get further inland, like Nevada, Utah, Montana, Idaho, the numbers drop dramatically, and we're talking handfuls of people, possibly in the States at that time.
Throughout the 30s, tensions do start to rise with Japan. How did that affect the Japanese American community? Were they seen as a potential threat from the American government?
They were seen as a threat by the American government. And in fact, the FBI was already doing surveillance on a large number of Japanese Americans. And when I say Japanese Americans in this context, it's individuals of Japanese ancestry that were in America, because those who were born here were citizens and technically Japanese Americans. Those who were immigrants were prohibited from naturalizing at that time, and they were considered aliens ineligible to citizenship. But colloquially, when I say Japanese Americans, I mean all individuals of Japanese ancestry at this time. So the FBI was surveilling them. If anyone had a leadership role in the community or had any contact with individuals from Japan, they were followed, they were surveilled, and records were kept on their activities. So that by the time Pearl Harbor happened, and by the time the roundup of Japanese Americans happened, there was what was known as the ABC list, those who were on the A list, the B list, and the C list in terms of level of interaction and involvement with people from Japan.
I was going to get to Pearl Harbor. Did the American... for a catch-all phrase, government, did they have a plan in place for if there was an attack by Japan on America, that they just went, there you go, or are they literally making it up on the spur of the moment, their reaction?
There are differing opinions on that, and I think that it's a little bit of both. And what I mean by that is there's certainly preparation in terms of, like I mentioned, the ABC list, the surveillance of Japanese Americans who had contact with Japan. So there certainly was consideration of who was suspect and who the government would want to know more about and so forth. The actual plans, I think, developed very quickly once Pearl Harbor happened in terms of where the camps would be and how they would round them up. There was debate even in Roosevelt's cabinet as to what they should do and how they should do it. So there wasn't a specific plan that was completely agreed upon, but there was certainly the sentiment of which way they would go in dealing with individuals of Japanese ancestry in America.
What was the popular reaction to the Japanese American community post Pearl Harbor? Because they are part of, obviously, they are a community within themselves, part of a bigger community that they interact within.
Varied. So, for example, in Hawaii, Japanese Americans made up 40% of the workforce and roughly that same percentage of the population. So they were a much larger part of the fabric of society in Hawaii. And people knew them not as simply a race, but as individuals, right? And so there was much more support for the Japanese American community in Hawaii. And arguably, the Japanese Americans in Hawaii were not incarcerated en masse. The leaders were taken away, but the mass incarceration didn't happen in Hawaii. And we can get back to that in a minute. There's some other reasons why that's the case. On the continent, Japanese Americans tended to live more in segregated communities, in townships or areas where there was a large population of Japanese Americans, just because it made more economic sense and social sense to live around people that were similar to yourself. On the continent, non-Japanese Americans who live in proximity to Japanese Americans would have varying responses. I mean, I've heard many stories of white Americans who were very supportive of Japanese Americans because they knew them. They went to school with them. They knew them as families and as individuals. A good friend of mine, Yosh Nakamura, who was one of the soldiers during World War II, talked about when he and his family were sent off to a camp, his white classmates sat on their front lawn crying as they saw one of their best friends being taken away and not understanding. Now that is not the norm. I want to be very clear about that. But I mean, it does indicate there were non-Japanese American families who supported and knew of the Japanese American experience on the West Coast. For the most part, however, there was a tremendous amount of racism that was prevalent at that particular time. And as I mentioned earlier, during World War II, the Nazis were viewed as evil men. The Japanese were viewed as an evil subhuman species. It's a very different way that Middle America viewed them. The other dynamic that was taking place at that time is by the 1940s, in the 30s and the 1940s, Japanese American families had taken over farmland. They couldn't own the farmland for the most part, but they could lease it. And they had made it into very productive areas, that were very competitive with other farms and so forth. And that was viewed, one, as an economic threat, and two, as an economic opportunity. If you get the Japanese Americans off these farmlands, well, then you could take over these productive lands that prior to that had not been very productive. So along with the racism, along with the wartime hysteria that would eventually happen after World War II, there was the dynamic of economic greed. And it played out differently because on the continent, to get Japanese Americans into these camps, well, then you could take over their productive farmlands. But in Hawaii, if you were to incarcerate the Japanese Americans en masse, the plantations would shut down because 40% of your workforce would be gone overnight. So greed, in a sense, protected the community in Hawaii while it led to the incarceration or contributed to the incarceration on the continent.
I hadn't thought about that before. When you play with, I was anti-Nazi feeling. One is against an idea. It's not anti-German, it's anti-Nazism. Whereas the propaganda against Japan was against the people. It is against the racist idea, isn't it? Because you get all those cartoons. I hadn't thought of it that way, and it's quite a nuanced way of thinking of how the country demonized the other side. One's demonizing its idea of policies, and the other's is literally the race of peoples.
Exactly. Yes. And in fact, there are a number of quotes talking about how Japanese Americans are like snakes, and a viper will always be a viper. It lays the eggs of a viper, and so forth. So even though these young men had been born and raised in America, they were still seen as being the enemy.
In some respects, the populist reaction is often more extreme than the political reaction. And I wonder, was there anybody batting for the Japanese American community as a whole, sort of trying to stand up for their rights at this period?
And again, keep in mind that most Japanese Americans lived in Hawaii or on the west coast of the continent. If you lived anywhere east of that, most people weren't even aware of this concept of Japanese Americans, So for most of America at that particular time, this was an issue that they weren't aware of. We were at war with Japan. We were at war with Germany. There were people were sending their sons off to war and so forth. And that's what consumed much of the American thought, especially those that had had no interaction with Japanese Americans. In Hawaii, there were individuals, non-Japanese Americans, who stood up for Japanese Americans. One particular individual that comes to mind is John Burns, who was the chief of police in Honolulu. He would later become the governor of Hawaii. He was very supportive of Japanese Americans. On the continent, very not so much. And the ACLU, various individuals from the ACLU did stand up. The Quakers many times would help their fellow neighbors and so forth and take care of their property. But the ACLU as a national organization wasn't supportive of Japanese Americans until much later in the war.
What's the ACLU?
The American Civil Liberties Union. So, and they in the U.S. are probably the forefront of the organizations which propose to protect civil liberties.
So when they're looking to round up Japanese on the west coast of America and essentially remove them, aren't they, lock, stock and barrel, where does that stand legally? Because, as you say, a large swathe of them are American citizens.
That's the $1 million question, isn't it? You're right about by the time this is happening, December 7th happens, 1941. It thrusts the United States into World War II. And Japanese Americans immediately began to wonder what would happen to us. Would we be treated like the American citizens we were? 2/3 of us had been born in the United States by that time. And the other third had been there 30, 40, 50 years, but they were prohibited from becoming American citizens. Well, we got our answer 2 months later when President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066 on February 19th, 1942. And that set the underpinnings by which nearly 120,000 individuals would be forcibly removed and into these concentration camps. Was it legal? At that time, it was proposed to be legal because it was for military necessity. There were no challenges at that time to the incarceration in these camps. There were 3 individuals who refused the curfew orders, because initially there were curfew orders, and then there was the exclusion orders, and then the incarceration. But Gordon Hirabayashi, Min Yasui, and Fred Korematsu were 3 Japanese Americans who refused the curfew and exclusion orders. Eventually, all 3 of their cases go to the Supreme Court during World War II, and all are found to be guilty. the Supreme Court weighs in and says that the decision to impose curfews and to impose the exclusion were constitutional. That changes 50 years later in the 80s when a young group of attorneys brings up what's known as the coram nobis cases. And coram nobis is a writ where you can apply it to a case if a person has been convicted, already served their time, and there's found to be a fundamental injustice in the process of the hearings. And the fundamental injustice that was discovered 40 years after the war was that the Solicitor General of the United States had purposely withheld information from the Supreme Court in the cases of Korematsu, Hirabayashi, and Yasui. Essentially, the evidence that was withheld was that the Office of Naval Intelligence, the FBI, the Central Intelligence Agency, and the Office of Naval Intelligence had all issued statements saying that Japanese Americans pose no threat to the United States. The Solicitor General knew that existed, and he withheld that information, and that was the basis upon which the fundamental injustice could be demonstrated. And so the trial court decisions for Korematsu and Hirabayashi were overturned. So technically, the Supreme Court decisions still are on the books, but all legitimate legal scholars in the United States understand that that's with a major asterisk and that the trial court convictions were overturned in 2 of the 3 cases. So that's a long-winded way of answering the question of was it legal?
It's very difficult to imprint yourself from the future onto the past, but I was going to say the Attorney General, I wonder how much he sat there taking a populist view and just signing it off kind of thing, rather than actually listening to the experts and saying there's no threat, which is perhaps a reflection of him at the time.
I'm going to jump ahead in the story, but in the 1980s, there was a federal commission called the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians. And it was created under President Jimmy Carter to explore and investigate what happened during World War II. And in their final analysis, they said that the camps were wrong and that the camps were the result of race prejudice, wartime hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. And I would add greed, as we talked about earlier. But I think the first 2, wartime hysteria and race prejudice, came together in a very negative way and had a very negative impact on our nation's ability to live up to its values and to really keep the Constitution front and center. Yeah. But one other example of that is at the time that all this was happening, the Attorney General of California was a man named Earl Warren. He would later go on to become governor of California, and he would later go on to become a Supreme Court justice here in the United States. Earl Warren was a strong defender of the constitutional rights of individuals. But during World War II, he was a strong proponent of incarcerating Japanese Americans. He was very vocal. He was Attorney General and then later governor, as I mentioned, and he was a proponent of incarcerating Japanese Americans. In his memoirs, his decision to support the incarceration was one of his, what he considered one of his 2 major mistakes in his career. And he was very remorseful for having taken that stance. And even to the point of saying something along the lines that, he had been a father of 6. And when he thinks of all the young children that had been torn from their communities, torn from their schools and placed in these concentration camps across the United States, on a very personal level, he was his word was conscience-stricken.
Let's go back to this, the law when it's enacted. How are they? I was going to use the phrase military roundups, but is that what happened when they're ordering people from their homes? How are they doing it? Are they sending the army into the streets, or do people get a polite letter asking them to turn up at the railway station and you pack your bag and you'll be away for a couple of days?
So notices were placed all over in strategic locations, instructing all individuals of Japanese ancestry, both aliens and non-aliens. And let's think about that for a second. We all know what aliens are in this context, somebody not from the country. But what's a non-alien, right? I mean, when you think about it, a non-alien is a citizen. But the government knew, the U.S. government knew they couldn't say all Japanese Americans, both aliens and citizens of the United States, are going to be rounded up and thrown into these camps, blah, blah, blah. So they came up with this euphemism of non-alien. So they would post it and they would have it in the newspapers, and they got the word out as best they could. And it would tell people in certain areas of the city where to report on a certain day. They could bring what they could carry, and they would be bussed off. First, in Los Angeles, for example, many of them were taken to the local horse race track, Santa Anita horse race track, where they would be housed literally in horse stables for several months. So to go back to your question, the government already knew where all these Japanese Americans lived. And the way they knew it is that they had access to the U.S. Census, which is a violation of our laws in this country, where the U.S. Census is supposed to be confidential and so forth. But clearly, and there's been evidence to demonstrate this, that the U.S. government used the census data to be able to identify where all Japanese Americans lived. So I think, the question then becomes, why did the Japanese Americans cooperate? Why didn't they just say, hell no, we're not going to go? Why didn't they resist? And in fact, this becomes a question much later as the younger Japanese Americans 30, 40, 50 years later said, why didn't you resist? We would have resisted. And it's important to keep in mind that this was a small, disenfranchised community. It didn't have friends in high places. The sentiment, as you've asked, of the nation was either they didn't know about it or, let's send these people off to camp. And had they resisted, the Army had plans to use physical force to make sure that they cooperated. People would have died. There would have been blood in the streets, and it would have been one-sided, because it's not as if the Japanese American community was armed or had any real. These were families, with small children and so forth, and so it would have been very, very bloody at that point. And the main Japanese American organization at that time was the Japanese American Citizens League, the JACL. And their president was a young man. He was in his 30s, named Mike Masaoka. And Mike had been very involved with negotiating with the American government as to how this would be carried out, and would he encourage cooperation on the part of the Japanese American community. And ultimately, he did encourage the community to cooperate. And in his memoir, I've always been struck by his comment, which he said, I was not about to give a doubting nation any more reason to doubt us. Had we resisted the forced exclusion, right or wrong, had we resisted, it would have been seen as resistance. It would have been seen as an act of treason on the part of Japanese Americans, and it would have validated the perception that we weren't true Americans and that we're not interested in supporting the United States. It was really a catch-22. You're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. But in that situation, given those options, Japanese Americans, by and large, said, we will cooperate. Again, there were folks who were verbally saying this is wrong and so forth, but there was really no option to physically resist the exclusion. And as you see people being loaded onto buses or loaded onto trains, it's under armed guard. I mean, the Army was out there with bayonets on their guns, having their rifles fully exposed. I mean, I can only imagine how terrifying that would be for young children, but even families, because you don't want to see your children and your spouses and your family being shot up at that particular time.
I was just looking before we started at pictures, and there was a particularly striking one of a train pulled up with American soldiers shoulder to shoulder along the platform, and it's a tremendous show of force for what are families, as you say. They're not all men. They're mixed families being loaded onto the train.
And Angus, if I can share one other anecdote, and I share this a lot with young students or even adults that I speak to, is the other heart-wrenching part of this is that if you had pets, you had to literally let them go on the streets, because who could you leave your dog with or your cat with? You couldn't leave them with your neighbors. Your neighbors, for the most part, were Japanese American. Couldn't leave them with family because they're all going to camp with you. So that there are a good number of stories when you talk to people today where if they start thinking about it, I wonder what happened to Skippy. I wonder what happened to Fluffy, because they literally sometimes just let them go. And I'm a dog owner, a dog lover, and I can't imagine letting my two dogs go and not knowing what's happening to them, So just even on that very human level, how painful the incarceration was, along with losing your house, losing your job, losing your community. I mean, all of that, but it boils down to also losing members of your family.
I'm fascinated by something you've already touched upon. The language, the official language used is surprisingly loaded to justify almost what the American government's doing.
Yes. And in fact, if you notice, I use very specific language as I talk about this. I don't say that we were evacuated. I say that we were forcibly excluded from the West Coast. The reason I say that is because generally when you say you evacuate people, it's voluntary and it's for their own good. It's for their own protection. Neither was the case here. It was not voluntary, and it wasn't necessarily for our own protection. Even when we were in camp, they said they incarcerated us for our own protection. But the guard towers that surrounded each of these camps, the machine guns were pointed inward, not outward. So again, what was the real purpose? I don't say interned or internment camp. I use the terms concentration camp. I use the term incarcerated. And I use the term inmates or incarcerees, because truly that's what was occurring. The term internment or intern has a very technical meaning. And when you intern someone during wartime, you are incarcerating an enemy alien. So had we taken individuals from Japan who happen to be here and incarcerate them, then technically intern would be the correct term. But you don't intern citizens of your own country. You are incarcerating them against their will, and intern becomes an inappropriate use of the term.
We're going to take a short break. We'll be back with you in a moment. Welcome back. I'm joined by Mitchell Marquet, and we're discussing the Japanese-American experience in World War II. You touched upon the camps. I was saying, what were these camps like? So I was looking at pictures again earlier, and they're not holiday camps, are they? When you're talking about incarceration, that kind of is sort of what they seem to look like to me.
There were 10 War Relocation Authority camps. Each of them housed between 8,000 to 12,000 people. So these were little cities in many ways, right? And when you see photos of them, they are just rows and rows of long army-style barracks. And they were oftentimes located in the most desolate, godforsaken places that you can imagine. I've been to about half of them. There's a place called Manzanar in California, located in the middle of the desert. During the summer, it got well over 100 degrees, and in the winter, it was freezing. There are other camps that were literally built next to swamplands or in desolate areas where there's nothing surrounding them for miles and miles and miles. Usually they were surrounded by barbed wire and with machine gun towers, as I mentioned. And everything was very communal in terms of the communal living experience. You had your barracks, and initially these barracks would house maybe 4 or 5 families. And when the families first moved in, they would hang blankets or sheets to divide the living areas. So there was literally no privacy. You could hear the family next door talking about whatever they were arguing about or complaining about and whatnot. Eventually, the families would be able to build wooden partitions between them and have a little bit more sense of privacy. But even then, you can hear through wood walls and so forth. Food was served in the mess halls. And so it was a very much communal eating in that sense. And that started to affect the family structure. As the men would eat together, the women and young children would eat together, the teenagers would eat together, which might be fun for a week or so if you really were on a camping trip type of thing. But over 3 or 4 years, you can imagine what that did to the family structure. The internal family structure started to deteriorate. The shower facilities and the latrines had no privacy. Initially when these camps were built, the latrines would just be a barrack or some kind of building. You go in there and there'd be long planks with holes cut in it, and you do your business there. And for the Japanese during that time, especially the elderly, especially the women who valued their privacy, and the thought of going to the restroom in front of others was just a horrendous thought. We would hear stories of the women would wait till late at night. They'd find a large cardboard box or something, or even just a blanket, and go to the latrine, cover themselves so that there would be some semblance of privacy. There were schools, and each camp had a hospital. And what people will see if they look at photos, especially the photos that were government-issued photos, is the positive side, if you will. The camps were open anywhere from 3 to 5 years. And so during that time, schools were built. There would be sporting activities, baseball games, basketball games, things to pass the time. At several of these camps, the inmates would go and create gardens to the best of their ability and, channel the water so that it would irrigate the gardens and so forth. So I view these activities as really a demonstration of the human spirit, that in the middle of this desolate, inhumane treatment, they were able to create a sense of community. Now, Angus, let me be very clear. When I use the word concentration camp, I am in no way equating what happened to Japanese Americans to what happened to Jews in Nazi Germany. No reasonable person makes that comparison. The incarceration of 120,000 people for 3 to 5 years versus the extermination or annihilation of 6 million Jewish individuals. I mean, there's no comparison in that. But I think it's important that we use words to capture the essence of what the experience was like. And in fact, in Germany, in Nazi Germany, the Jews referred to those camps as death camps and extermination camps. And I think those are the words that we should be using to describe that experience. And again, just to be clear with your listeners that there's no comparison between them.
It's certainly, people should be encouraged to have a look because for pictures, because they are huts concentrated together in large areas, huts row after row after row of them. People living on top of each other in barbed wire compounds. Right. They're reminiscent of prisoner of war camps was my immediate thought, actually, when you start thinking of those in those terms, those sort of barrack huts, 12-foot high barbed wire fences, watchtowers. You mentioned the remote locations. Do we know why they picked those locations? Were they hiding this away, or because they could have just, ghettoed them, or you just mentioned the remote locations. I just wondered if we knew why they chose them.
That's a good question. I think part of it was for quote unquote security reasons. I'll give you an example. In Arkansas, there were 2 camps, and in one of the camps, there was a town of white Americans that was several miles away. And when it was announced that they would be building a concentration camp there and housing 10,000, Japanese Americans who were viewed as these were this enemy race, that was hell-bent on killing Americans, it created fear in the local community because they didn't have much experience with Japanese Americans. Arkansas may have had a handful of Japanese Americans prior to World War II. And now 10,000 of them would be living, just a mile or two away from the township, right? So I think it was easier in some respects to put them in remote areas where it would be much easier to control the reaction as well as control the Japanese American population.
Those who were incarcerated who were citizens, are they still eligible for the draft?
What happened right after December 7th is there were Japanese Americans who were in the service at that time, especially in Hawaii. Within a few weeks after December 7th, 1941, they were all declared 4C, ineligible to service, based solely on their ethnicity. And while they couldn't be dismissed from the service, they were sidelined. And that really frustrated, especially the young men from Hawaii who they were there on Oahu when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. They saw the bombs falling. They felt the vibration of the explosions. They knew people who had been injured or possibly killed because civilians were killed on that day. They were raring to go to fight for the United States, because for them it was personal. On the continent, many Japanese Americans had never even heard of Pearl Harbor. It's like, where is this? And Hawaii, yeah, that's out in the Pacific somewhere and so forth. But they were all declared ineligible for military service at that time. But once the war begins, through a series of events and circumstances and actions by the Japanese American community, the U.S. Army, realizing, one, that they needed more men to go fight in Europe, decided to create a segregated unit. And it first came out of Hawaii. They were known as the 100th Battalion. And these were young men, Japanese Americans, who had been in the National Guard and in the reserves, and they were mobilized to fight as a segregated unit. And the decision to keep them segregated was purposeful, because it was understood that the nation didn't trust them, and it was important to keep them together. If you sprinkled Japanese Americans across all the different units, even if they did something heroic, it would be lost, and then we wouldn't really know what the reception would have been for them in these other units. So the decision was to keep them together. The 100th goes into battle, and they become known as the Purple Heart Battalion, because they are just getting crushed and suffering huge casualties, but demonstrating great success on the battlefield. They were also known as the Little Men of Iron. So, if you read the stories of their first battles, tremendous losses, but tremendous valor. And they almost immediately began to earn the respect of their commanding officers, who were white at that time. Based on the success of the 100th Battalion, they just decide to create a full regimental combat team, and they call it the 442nd. And the 442nd is the regimental combat team, and the 100th becomes their first battalion. It's at this point that the call goes out to Japanese Americans, both in Hawaii as well as in the on the continent, in the concentration camps, for young Japanese American men to volunteer for this unit. Think about that just for a moment, right? You're asking young men to volunteer to fight for liberty and justice, while in Hawaii, they're being treated as second-class citizens. But even worse, on the continent, their families are incarcerated behind barbed wire after losing everything, their homes, their jobs, their communities. When I ask young people today, how many of you would volunteer under those circumstances? Almost to a person, they all say, hell no, I'm not going to do that. But it was a very different time 80 years ago. It was still a very difficult decision. How do I leave my parents, who some of them don't speak English? How do I leave them in this godforsaken camp in the middle of a desert to go off and fight for a nation that has taken everything away from them, and I might die in the process? That doesn't sound like a rational choice. But on the other hand, for many of these young men, they understood that in 1943, 1944, 45, loyalty needed to be demonstrated in blood. And there was a young soldier, and his name will come back in the story. His name was Kazuo Masuda, and they asked him, why are you doing this? Why are you fighting for a nation while your own family is incarcerated behind barbed wire. And his general response was, because this is the only way that I know that my family can have a chance in America. On the first day that they could volunteer, 10,000 young men from Hawaii went to sign up. In the camps, it was a much smaller number, as you can imagine, as it was a much more difficult decision. About 1,200 signed up on that first day, but thousands would follow, both from Hawaii as well as from the continent. And here's the amazing part of the story. They would go on to become the most highly decorated unit of their size in American military history for their size and length of service. Young men whose families were incarcerated in camp would become the most highly decorated unit in American military history. Unfortunately, most of the medals that they were awarded were the Purple Heart, and that's the medal that you receive when you're wounded or you're killed. But it is a tremendous story about the dynamic of being a son of an immigrant. Eventually, women would also volunteer stateside. Japanese American women would volunteer stateside to work with the Women's Auxiliary Corps and as nurses and so forth. So they were doing their part, but they didn't see combat. And this was towards the middle and the end of the war.
It's where passive acceptance becomes of going to the camps, and then they're almost accepted back into the war effort. The camps are closed, I think. Are the camps closed before the end of the war, or they start closing before the end of the war? What's the catalyst for them closing?
Well, the camps really closed at the end of the war. The Supreme Court issued a decision in late 1945 that the camps should be closing. By that time, the war was over. So essentially, it happened simultaneously. The camps closed anywhere between 1945 and 1947. It depends. It's a process to close the camps. And interestingly, the people who stayed in the camps the longest tended to be the elderly, because they didn't know where to go.
I was going to say, where'd you go back to? Exactly.
The idea of starting over, rebuilding community, that's a young person's challenge kind of thing. But if you're elderly and you've been living the last 4 years in a certain area, and not that you like it, but you've become accustomed to it and you feel relatively comfortable there, there was fear about going back into a racist society that may not treat them with much grace. But as Japanese Americans left camp, of course, the number one thing on their minds was, let's put a roof over our head, let's get a job, let's put food on the table, let's send our kids back to school, let's rebuild our community. But there was also another feeling, and that was a feeling of shame, a feeling that somehow we had done something to bring this tremendous or egregious violation of the Constitution upon us. It really was, in psychological terms, identification with the aggressor. We viewed this as we had not been American enough. And so the general feeling for many of the families leaving after the war was, let's be 110% American. Let's be so American that this will never happen to us again. Let's send our kids to good schools. Let's make sure that they demonstrate that they're good Americans. And again, this will never happen to us again. And that's why people my age, and I'm 62, and people a little bit older than myself, we don't speak Japanese because our parents didn't want us speaking Japanese. They wanted us speaking the King's English. They wanted us demonstrating that we were good Americans.
Post-war, quite quickly after the war, is it 48? They do receive some compensation from the US government. And I think that's intriguing. What's driving the American government to feel that they need to compensate them? Because it could well have just been brushed under the carpet.
First, it's important to understand that the 1948 Evacuation Claims Act covered only property losses. So you had to demonstrate that you lost property during that. And when I say property, belongings or everything from that to land. But the key is you had to have receipts for what you lost. And I don't know about you, but if I'm told I have 3 days to pack my belongings and go someplace and I have no idea where I'm going, receipts are not the thing I pack. So it is estimated that only 10% or 10 cents on every dollar that was lost was reimbursed through the Evacuation Claims Act. But more important, what the Evacuation Claims Act failed to do was to acknowledge the loss of constitutional rights or the violation of constitutional rights. The Evacuation Claims Act did not say, what happened to Japanese Americans was wrong constitutionally. It simply said there were losses and we will reimburse you for that. A couple of things also occurred in context. It can't be understated the importance of the role of the Japanese American soldiers. When they came back from war, they came back with an attitude of, I shed blood for this country. My friends, my brothers died for this country. And so they returned with a sense of, and I use this word in the most positive sense, with a sense of entitlement that, we are as American as anyone else, and we have died to prove that. It wasn't an idea that was shared by most Americans at that time. When the soldiers returned to Hawaii, they really helped to transform the territory of Hawaii, because at that time, Hawaii was still a territory. Many of the soldiers went back, used the GI Bill, would go back to school, and they became the political, education, and business leaders of Hawaii. And that really led to what's known as the Democratic Revolution in that state. And by 1959, Hawaii becomes the 50th state of the United States. And truly, for anyone who knows Hawaii right now, if you go to Hawaii, Japanese Americans are a big part of the fabric and the leadership of that state. They've had several Japanese American governors, several Japanese American senators and representatives. A good proportion of the business leaders are Japanese American. The education leaders are primarily Japanese American. So it really helped to transform that state. On the continent, maybe to a lesser degree because the numbers were so much smaller, but Japanese Americans came back and really felt like we wanted to elevate our status in the United States, and going hand in hand with that sense of shame that somehow we had contributed to this egregious violation.
We were talking about memory before we started, and I wondered if there's how the camps have been remembered. Is there a changing narrative from those late 40s through to George Bush Sr., isn't it, who signs the Redress Bill? Have I got that right? It's Reagan that signed.
Well, it's actually Ronald Reagan signed the bill, but George Bush signed the apology letter, because Reagan signed the bill at the end of his term, and then by the time the payments started coming out in the letters, George Bush was the president at that time.
Because you've already mentioned that you try to be very American, at which point do you forget? And so there must be a narrative of remembrance. Although, as we both pointed out, it's amazing how much people seem to have forgotten about the war.
No, I would argue the very opposite happened. And it's a great question about how has the narrative changed. During World War II, Japanese Americans would talk about the camp and say, shikata ga nai, which means it can't be helped. And it really was viewed as a social misfortune to be born Japanese in America, because this is what happens to Japanese in America. You get thrown into a camp and it's just the way it is. And it was a social misfortune. Over the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the nation, the United States, goes through tremendous changes, right? We have the Civil Rights Movement. We have Hawaii becoming a state, which then allows Japanese Americans to have access to Congress. The first representative from Hawaii was a young man named Daniel Inouye, who would later go on to become the longest serving senator. But he was a member of the 442nd. He was a Japanese American who fought for this nation and lost his right arm in doing so. So what better symbol of loyalty could we send to Washington, D.C.? The 60s, we have the Civil Rights Movement, the Women's Rights Movement, the Ethnic Studies Movement, which allows young Japanese Americans to say, what the hell happened during World War II? Why did this happen to us? Why did our parents and grandparents cooperate? We want to learn more about this. And the other thing that happened during the 60s was the anti-Vietnam War movement, where Americans, young Americans in particular, learned how to say, hell no, I won't go, and learned that dissent can be viewed as an American value. So it really was a decade of political and cultural change, especially for the young folks coming up. In the 70s, and this is where it gets to the narrative, the Japanese American community was really torn as to how it wanted the narrative to be about the camp. There were some who said, just forget about it. Let it go. I don't want to talk about it anymore. Don't make me remember what happened. That tended to be the elderly, as they didn't want to have to relive that horrendous time during their life. There was another group, a portion of the community that said, we deserve an apology. What was done to us was wrong, and we deserve a good, clean apology. And then there was a third group that said, you're right, we deserve an apology, and we deserve monetary reparations with that because there were real losses, and we need to be compensated for the loss of our constitutional rights. Even if it's symbolic, there's got to be some admission of wrong there.
That's what amazed me, that the redress movement and actually the financial recompense.
And what's amazing when you think about it is in the 70s, the American government had never apologized to anyone, let alone provide money to anyone, right? So to ask for an apology and money was the impossible dream, and hence the title of my book, Achieving the Impossible Dream, right? And through a series of events, and I'd be happy to come back and spend another couple hours with you talking about the redress movement, and it's a tremendous story of a small disenfranchised community finding the courage decades later to stand up to the American government and say, you did me wrong. You did me wrong, and we are deserving of an apology. If I can share just one quick anecdote with you, Angus. In the early 60s at UCLA, which, in Los Angeles, one of the major universities, there was a professor named Roger Daniels, and he had a history class. And he said, first assignment is everybody writes their autobiography. So all the students write an autobiography. He had two young Japanese Americans in his class, and both of them turned in their autobiographies. And it starts off, I was born in Los Angeles in 1943, blah, 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 blah. And Dr. Daniels calls him into his office, and he says, there's a problem with your autobiographies. And they said, we didn't cheat, Dr. Daniels. How do you cheat on an autobiography, right? So he says, that's not what I'm talking about. Go home, show your autobiography to your parents, come back and see me. And sure enough, the next day, one of the young men came back and he said, you're right, Dr. Daniels. I showed my autobiography to my parents. And I was born in 1943, but I wasn't born in Los Angeles. I was born in Manzanar, a concentration camp. The pain, the shame, the wanting to forget was so powerful for some families that they didn't even tell their children the truth about where they had been born or what had happened to them. So that's in the early 60s. And by the 70s, we're now as a community starting to say, no, we want to talk about this. And you did us wrong, and we're deserving of an apology. Fast forward to the early 80s, there's a commission hearing, as I mentioned before, that traveled the nation, hearing testimony from Japanese Americans and from the architects of the camps across the nation, and hearing the testimonies. And it was at these hearings that Japanese Americans, oftentimes for the very first time, would tell their stories of their loss, their suffering, their anger, and their unresolved feelings about what had gone on. And if I can tell you two very quick anecdotes, there was a friend of mine was working in San Jose with the elderly, and he told them, go to San Francisco. The commission is coming to San Francisco and testify about your experience. And most of them said, no, we can't. It's too scary. For them, going before a federal commission and talking about what had happened was like going before the pearly gates of heaven and saying to God, you gave me a lousy life or something, too intimidating. Finally, he convinced 6 of them to go. And he said on the van ride from San Jose to San Francisco, you could hear a pin drop in that van because they were petrified about what they were about to do. They went to San Francisco. They testified before the commission. And he said on the way home, all you could hear was laughing and singing and them slapping each other on the back because they had begun to face their demons. And they had begun to find the courage to change that narrative, as your question asks, and to tell their story. In Los Angeles, I was a college student at that time, and I remember at the LA hearings, there was a man named Kiyoshi Sonoda, and he was a dentist when he went to camp. And because he had medical training, he was put in charge of the infirmary. He described his first patient, which was a young dehydrated infant. And he said because he didn't have the right supplies or the right equipment, all he could do was hold that infant in his hands and feel his last twitch before he died. And as he told that story, Dr. Sonoda had tears streaming down his face. And in the audience, his wife was sitting there, and she said, Kiyoshi's crying. Kiyoshi doesn't cry. Kiyoshi didn't even cry at his own father's funeral. But on that day, Dr. Sonoda did cry. And I can tell you, because I was there, a room full of people cried with him as we finally were telling the stories of our pain. And as powerful as that is, I think the more powerful testimonies really occurred in people's homes as the young people started to ask their parents and their grandparents, hey, tell us what happened. Why did you go to camp? What was it like there? And their parents and grandparents would tell them their stories, maybe for the first time. Then the parents and grandparents would say, can we really get an apology? Can we really get redress? And the answer was, we don't know, but we have to try. And that was the watershed moment where the narrative begins to change, from we're not going to forget what happened to us. This was not a social misfortune. It was a political injustice that was done to us. And from there, then, the commission issues its findings. The camps are wrong. The camps were the results of wartime hysteria, race prejudice, and a failure of political leadership. And from there, then, we move on to fighting for the bill in Congress.
It's incredible to try to get any government to apologize for anything is almost impossible. Let's put it there. It's still relatively recent history.
Right, and people were still alive, right? The victims were still alive. And just to fast forward, the bill passes the House of Representatives on September 17th, 1987. And we chose that date specifically to argue the bill on the House floor because it was the anniversary of the 200th years of the Constitution being signed. So, very appropriate, right? And the bill passes with 243 representatives in the U.S. Congress voting for it. 180 of them were Democrats, 63 of them were Republicans, and some of the most conservative Republicans, people who are well-known, Newt Gingrich, Henry Hyde, Dick Cheney, they all voted for this bill because they understood that this was about the violation of the Constitution. It wasn't about Japanese Americans per se. It was about Americans who we didn't live up to our commitment to the Constitution. 7 months later, it passes the Senate, and that's because one of the senators from Hawaii, Spark Matsunaga, who was a veteran during World War II, he fought with the 100th and the Military Intelligence Service. He had personally lobbied all 99 other senators. And by the time it hit the floor, there were 71 co-sponsors. So we knew that it was going to pass the Senate. So now we needed just one more person to sign on, and that was the President of the United States, right? And in 1988, the President of the United States is none other than Ronald Reagan. And for those individuals who don't know Ronald Reagan, very conservative president. There were many of us, and I have to admit, myself included, that thought there's no way on God's green earth that Ronald Reagan is going to sign this bill. It's just not going to happen, right? We had fought the good fight, but the true believer said, no, we've come this far. We've got to figure out a way to get him to sign this bill. The thing about Ronald Reagan is his own administration had been fighting against the apology and redress in the courts as well as in the Congress. So, again, it looked very bleak. But the thing about Ronald Reagan, whether you agreed with his policies or not, most people would agree that Ronald Reagan was a great communicator. He had the ability to tell stories and speak in a way that would touch people's hearts and move them in a certain direction. Well, the opposite was true of Ronald Reagan. If you could tell him a story that would touch his heart, that would make him feel it on a personal level, you could have a great advocate on your hands. So the question was, what story could we tell Ronald Reagan that would make him feel like, I get it, I understand this on just a visceral level? Well, remember I told you about the soldier, Kazuo Masuda. He was the one who said, I'm doing this because this is the only way I know my family can have a chance in America. 2 weeks after giving that interview, Sergeant Masuda was killed in battle in Italy, fighting for the United States of America. After the war, his family is released from Gila River concentration camp in Arizona, and they want to move back to their home in Santa Ana, California. And they're met with nothing but hate speech, racial taunts, and threats of bodily harm. And the Army realizes this is a PR fiasco. One of our own fallen heroes, his own family, can't move back home to where they were before the war. So they send out a contingent of Army officers to have a medal ceremony for the Masuda family at their home, to demonstrate this is a great American family. And in that contingent of Army officers was a young white American captain named Ronald Reagan. I mean, you can't write a better script than this, right? I mean, it's like made up. And that night at a America rally, Ronald Reagan speaks, and the Masudas are there. And he says, the blood that is soaked into the sands is all of one color. America stands unique in the world, the only country not founded on race, but on an ideal. Mr. and Mrs. Masuda, as one member of the American family to another, for what your son Kazuo did. Thanks. That story was relayed to President Reagan in the 80s, and his response was, I remember what those soldiers did for America. It personalized it for him, and it aligned it with his view of conservative values and America and the Constitution. And it wasn't the only reason, but it helped to position him so that he would go ahead and sign the Civil Liberties Act, which he did on August 10th, 1988. So again, it's the story of these soldiers who came from these camps where they had been deprived and their families deprived of their constitutional rights, and what they were able to do on the battlefield that 40 years later paid huge dividends, not just to Japanese Americans, but to all Americans who treasure the Constitution.
It is a remarkable story. As I said before we started, I didn't know much about the topic, but your book really is excellent, especially as it lays out the changing narrative of the Japanese American community. Thank you. Loyal listener, if you would like to read Mitchell's book, it is Achieving the Impossible Dream, How Japanese Americans Obtained Redress. Now, if you've enjoyed the podcast, why not become a patron of the show by making a small contribution of $1 or so each month? You help me find the time to put the show together. And you can find out more at patreon.com/WW2podcast. This podcast is made possible by contributions from listeners like you. So that's patreon.com/WW2podcast. Next time, I think we should be joined once more by Prit Buttar, and we'll be looking at the siege of Leningrad. So that is all from me for now. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our tank, blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice.